I was 8 months pregnant when his girlfriend cornered me alone in a parking garage and swung her designer purse straight at my unborn baby's stomach. And when I called my husband from the emergency room floor, his first words were, "You probably just fell. You know how clumsy pregnant women get." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if our daughter was okay. Because here's the thing I didn't know, yet he already knew exactly what happened. She called him first. What I thought was a cheating husband turned out to be something so much darker. Hidden bank statements, my private medical records forwarded to his mistress, a text message sent 30 minutes before she found me. Handle it. He didn't just cheat on me, he helped plan it. But what Richard Morrison never counted on was that his wife's big brother ran the security cameras in that garage, and he had been watching the whole time. This story is proof that when someone tries to destroy you quietly, the truth has a way of being very, very loud. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own life, stay with me because Grace's mother didn't just survive this. She rebuilt everything, and before this video ends, I think you'll understand exactly why betrayal sometimes gives you the life you were always meant to live. Hit like if you're already feeling this one, drop a comment telling me whose side you're on, and subscribe because every week on this channel, real strength sounds exactly like this.
She gave me a hard shove right against the car door. Being pregnant, my balance was already shot, and I just went down. My only thought was to protect you, my arms wrapping around my belly as I hit the hard concrete. My knee was scraped raw, and my hip was throbbing where her purse had hit. But all I cared about was you. I curled into a ball and just cried. "Maybe now you'll get the message," she said, fixing her blazers as if she was brushing off dust. "Richard belongs with me." And with that, she clicked away on her heels, leaving me there. I stayed on that cold floor for what felt like an eternity, just waiting, praying until I felt that familiar little flutter. "You are okay, Grace." I have never felt more grateful for anything in my entire life. My hands were shaking, but I got my phone out and found your Uncle Jake's number. He's always been my protector, even when we were just kids. He joined the Marines right after high school, did 3 tours, and then came home to start his own security company. If anyone knew what to do, it was Jake. "Jake," I whispered, when he picked up on the first ring. He knew right away. "Emma, what's wrong?" "I need you," I sobbed. "Something happened. She tried to hurt the baby." "Where are you?" His voice changed instantly to that calm, in-control tone he had in the service. "Memorial Medical Center, the parking garage." "Stay right there. I'm 10 minutes away." I just closed my eyes and waited. My other hand never left my belly. I remembered noticing security cameras when I'd parked. It was a hospital complex, so they had to have them. I remember half of me desperately hoping they'd recorded everything, and the other half dreading the thought of ever seeing it again. 8 minutes later, your Uncle Jake's black pickup truck screech-sawed into that garage. He was out and running toward me before the engine even died. "Emma!" He knelt beside me, his eyes quickly scanning for injuries. "Are you hurt? Is the baby okay?" He was every bit the Marine he used to be. At 35, he was still in incredible shape, and those sharp green eyes of his never missed a single detail. He built his company on being the best protector. "I think Grace is okay," I said, and he used his strong arm to help me to my feet. "She's been moving around, but my knee is all torn up, and my hip is aching where she hit me." "She?" His voice went quiet in that way that always meant danger. "Who did this?" I looked right into his eyes and saw the same fierce protector from our school playground 20 years ago. "Vanessa Hoffman, Richard's girlfriend." His jaw tightened. The marketing director at Morrison Tech Solutions. I was stunned. You know her? I know of her. My company handles security for a few buildings downtown, including your father's office. His face was like a thundercloud. She attacked you? A pregnant woman? And then I told him everything she said. My voice just cracked. She hit me with her purse, aimed right for my stomach. When I tried to move away, she just pushed me over. Jake gently got me into his truck, carefully buckling the seat belt around my belly. We're going to the emergency room, and then we're calling the police. I remember weakly protesting, saying something foolish about not wanting to hurt Richard's business. His business? Jake's voice was full of disbelief. Emma, his mistress assaulted you. I couldn't care less about his business. As we drove, he made a few calls on his hands-free system. I heard him tell his security team to pull the last 2 hours of footage from the garage. Yes, Jimmy, this is personal, he said. My sister was attacked. I need that footage locked down now. That's when it dawned on me, He'd been looking out for me in ways I never even knew. His company had contracts all over the city. He had built this invisible net to watch over me. When he was done with his calls, he asked me very gently, "How long have you known about Richard's affair?" 2 months, I admitted. I told him about the credit card bills for hotels and restaurants, and how, when I confronted your father, he said I was just being paranoid because of pregnancy hormones. I saw your uncle's knuckles go white on the steering wheel. You should have called me, he said. I thought I could handle it, I told him. I hoped after you were born, things would fix themselves. But I knew then, Vanessa was right about one thing. Richard really didn't want this baby. And if he didn't want you, Grace, then he didn't want me either. When we pulled into the emergency room and Jake came around to help me out, I felt something shift deep inside me. Not you, sweetie. You were moving around just fine. It was something else, a kind of hardening. The woman who walked into that doctor's appointment was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the truth. With your Uncle Jake beside me, I felt safe, truly safe, for the first time in months. But I also felt something else stirring. I was angry. Vanessa Hoffman had made a huge mistake targeting a pregnant woman, but she'd made an even bigger one by making bomb. There are mistakes, and then there are the kind of mistakes that change everything. Going after the sister of a man whose job is to keep people safe? That was one of them. No one lays a hand on my sister, I remember thinking, just over and over. I was pacing that emergency room like a caged animal, while Dr. Sarah Mitchell was checking on Emma. All my military training, all that stuff about staying calm, it just went out the window. This was my little sister, pregnant and hurt, because some woman thought she was above it all. After about 25 minutes, Dr. Mitchell came out with Emma, who looked shaky but resolute. The baby's completely fine, she said, and I felt a weight lift off me I hadn't even realized was there. The injuries are minor: a scraped knee, a bruised hip, but she needs to rest for a couple of days. Thank you, doctor, Emma whispered. I just looked at her face. The scrapes and bruises were nothing, you see, but the real damage was right there in her eyes. The woman who left for her checkup that morning was still holding onto a sliver of hope for her marriage. The woman sitting next to me then, though, she was someone who'd finally had to face the ugly truth. Emma, we have to go over what happened, I said softly once we were alone. I need every single detail. She told me again how Vanessa had been lying in wait for her in the parking garage, telling her Richard didn't want the baby and was going to divorce her once little Grace arrived. Try to think like a witness, I told her, that old training kicking in. What were her exact words about Richard's plan? She squeezed her eyes shut, and I knew she was right back there in that garage. She said his lawyer advised him to wait until after the birth because of the money. She had specific details, things an outsider wouldn't know. This wasn't just some messy affair blow-up. That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording, telling her it was for the official police report. As she talked, that hot anger inside me cooled down into something much more focused, much more dangerous. It's the kind of feeling that made me good at my job, both in the service and after. She aimed the purse at your stomach, specifically, I clarified. Yes, right at my belly. And then she pushed you when you tried to leave. She said maybe I'd get the hint if I couldn't even stand up. I stopped the recording and backed it up to my secure server. Then I looked at her. I have to ask you something, and I need you to be really honest with yourself. How long has Richard really been distant? She was quiet for what felt like a long time. It started around the 4th month of the pregnancy, she finally said. Right after we found out it was a girl. I just figured he was scared of being a dad, but what? I pressed. He stopped touching my stomach when she'd kick. He used to love that. Then came the late nights at work, more business trips, less time at home. And that, my dear, is when the pieces started clicking into place for me. Emma, there's something you need to know. My security firm covers several buildings downtown near Richard's office. His company isn't a client, but we do handle the security for the restaurant where he and Vanessa have been having their little business meetings. She just stared at me. You've been spying on him? Not on purpose, I explained. But after you told me about those weird credit card bills, a couple of months ago, I might have cross-referenced the locations with my client list. My face must have been grim. He's been there every Thursday for the last 8 months. Same table, same woman. They weren't nearly as clever as they thought. 8 months, Emma breathed out. Almost my whole pregnancy. Just then, my phone lit up with a text from my guy, Jimmy Thompson. I read it, and I'm sure my expression got even darker. What is it? Emma asked. Jimmy got the security video from the garage. It shows everything clear as day. Vanessa waiting, following you, the whole attack. We've got her on tape, deliberately going after a pregnant woman. The tears started again, but they were different this time. It wasn't about the pain or the fear anymore. It was this wave of relief, of knowing someone finally saw the truth and that she had proof. There's one more thing, I said, trying to be gentle. While Jimmy was getting the video, he ran a background check on Vanessa Hoffman. What kind of check? She asked. The kind that includes recent doctor's visits. I took her hand then. Emma, Vanessa's pregnant too. The news just hit her. You could see it. It was a completely different kind of blow. Pregnant? She echoed. 10 weeks, based on her records. Which means Richard started another family while I was carrying his daughter. Her voice was just hollow. So that's why he doesn't want Grace. He's just replacing us. I watched as something shifted in my sister's eyes. The hurt was still there, sure, but now it had company. Pure, unshakable resolve. Jake, I have to see that video. Are you sure? I asked. It's not going to be easy to watch. I need to. I need to know what I'm up against. So I pulled out my tablet and brought up the footage from our secure system. We sat there and watched Vanessa step out from behind a concrete pillar, corner Emma, and go after her. Run it back, Emma said, her voice low. We watched it 3 more times. Every time you'd see something new, Vanessa glancing at her watch, like she was on a schedule. The way she aimed so carefully for Emma's stomach. How she fixed her hair afterward, like she was moving on to the next item on her to-do list. This wasn't just a fit of rage, Emma said, thinking out loud. This was planned. And that's what turns it from a simple assault into something much more serious, I confirmed. Especially with you being pregnant, this could easily be a felony. She was silent for a few minutes, just taking it all in. Her husband's betrayal, his mistress carrying his other child, and the attack. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a strategic move to take out what Vanessa considered the competition. "I feel so foolish," she finally whispered. "No," I told her. "You were hopeful. That's not the same thing. You thought you could fix it by trying harder, by being the perfect wife." Her voice got stronger then. "But you can't repair a marriage by yourself." And right then, my phone started ringing. Richard's name popped up. I just turned the screen so Emma could see it. He probably got an alert from the insurance company about the ER visit, I guessed. "What do you want to do?" She just looked at the ringing phone. Then she reached out and took it. "I want to hear his excuse." She picked up on the fourth ring. "Hello, Richard." And his first words were, "Emma, what is this nonsense? I get a notification you're in the emergency room. Are you trying to cause problems for me?" I watched her face just shut down. Any tiny flicker of hope that was left in her eyes just went out. "I was assaulted in the medical center parking garage," she said, her voice perfectly calm, "by Vanessa." "That's absurd," he scoffed. "Vanessa wouldn't do that. You probably just fell. You know how clumsy pregnant women get." Our eyes met across the small room, and I saw my own anger reflected right back at me. "I see," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "So I imagined being shoved to the ground and someone swinging a purse at my unborn child." "I think you're overreacting," he said. "Vanessa told me she saw you, and you seemed a little emotional, but you were fine." "Vanessa told you?" Emma's tone was ice. "And when exactly did she tell you that, Richard?" You could almost hear him backtrack over the phone, realizing his mistake. She called me after. Just worried. Thought maybe she should have helped you to your car." "How very considerate of her," Emma said. "Did she also happen to mention that she's pregnant?" The silence on his end of the line went on for almost 30 seconds. "Richard," he finally said, "we'll talk about this when I get home." "No," she cut in. "No, we won't. Because you won't be coming home. The locks are being changed tonight. You can't do that. It's my house." "Watch me," she said, and hung up the phone. I just looked at her, filled with this incredible respect. "That was handled perfectly. I'm finished being a victim," she said, her voice firm. "Richard made his choice when he started a whole new family. Now, I'm making mine. So what's the plan? What do you need from me?" She glanced at the video still looping on my tablet, then at the police forms the doctor had given her. "I need you to help me keep Grace safe, and I need your help making sure Vanessa Hoffman answers for what she did." I gave her a grim little smile. It was the same one I used to get right before a mission, the one that always meant business, an enemy of my brother. As we left the hospital, I felt a certainty I hadn't felt in so long. I wasn't in this fight by myself anymore. Your father might have had all the money and the lawyers, but I had something better. I had a brother who knew how to go to war. I found out later that your father's first words were, "Vanessa would never do something like that." He was sitting up in his high-rise office on the 32nd floor, his perfect world finally starting to crack. At 32, he had built a multi-million-dollar company, but this was something he couldn't control. His phone had started ringing constantly. First, our insurance company about the ER visit, and then his mother, your grandmother, Patricia, who always had her ways of hearing about family drama. Old friends from high society. You know, Vanessa started calling me, every 10 minutes, and she sounded more and more panicked each time. My assistant buzzed me, saying, "Mr. Morrison, a Ms. Hoffman is here. She's saying it's an emergency." I remember straightening my tie, trying to get my head straight. I thought, Vanessa couldn't have possibly laid a hand on Emma. The whole idea felt ridiculous. She was this polished, smart, sophisticated woman who ran my entire marketing department like a pro. Not the kind to brawl in a parking garage. I told my assistant to send her in. She burst through the door in a wave of perfume, looking, well, not quite herself. Her makeup was a bit smudged, like she'd fixed it in a hurry, and her hands trembled as she walked over to my desk. "Oh, Richard, thank goodness," she said, wrapping her arms around me. I was so worried. "How is Emma?" "Is she okay?" I was just horrified when I saw her fall like that in the garage. I held her back a bit, just to look at her face. "Fall?" I asked. "Emma told me you pushed her." "Pushed her?" Her eyes went wide, like she was truly shocked. "Richard, I'd never touch a pregnant woman. I was just trying to talk to her, to make her see that what we had wasn't some cheap fling. I thought if she knew how much we cared for each other, maybe she'd agree to a quiet, civil divorce." "So what happened then?" "She became hysterical," Vanessa said, screaming at me, calling me all sorts of names. I tried to calm her down, but she got so worked up that she lost her footing and fell. I felt just awful about it. Her voice cracked, and honestly, it was pretty convincing. I wanted to help her, but she screamed at me to get away. I figured it was best to give her some space. And a part of me, a foolish part, felt this wave of relief. Her story just seemed to fit so much better. Emma had been so emotional during the pregnancy, with all the mood swings and outbursts. It sounds terrible to say, but I just chalked it up to hormones making her paranoid. My own mother had told me stories about things like that. I looked at Vanessa and said, she called the police just to see how she'd react. She went pale. "The police? But why?" "I'm telling you, she fell. I never laid a finger on her. She claims you hit her with your purse. That's ridiculous. Why on earth would I do that?" She moved in closer, using that soft, pleading voice that always made me want to protect her. "Richard, you know me. I'm not a violent person. I have never hurt a soul in my entire life." So I pulled her close, and all I could think was that Vanessa was everything Emma wasn't at that time. Driven, exciting, passionate. She understood my work, my ambitions, and didn't fill every conversation with talk of nurseries and baby names. "I know," I whispered into her hair. "Emma's just trying to find someone else to blame for being clumsy. This pregnancy has made her unstable." Vanessa leaned back, her eyes looking so bright and tearful. "There's something else, Richard. Something I have to tell you." I felt this sudden cold dread. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." I just stared at her, my mind completely blank. Pregnant. Vanessa was pregnant, and that meant, how long? I asked. 10 weeks. I got the final confirmation yesterday. She watched my face, looking so nervous. "I know this makes things messy, but, Richard, this could be our perfect chance. We could have a fresh start, build the family we always talked about." I just sank into my chair, trying to wrap my head around it. 2 pregnant women, 2 babies, 2 lives stretching out in front of me, and I couldn't see the path. "Richard?" Vanessa's voice was so small then, so full of doubt. "Please say something." I, I, I don't know what to say. This changes absolutely everything." "It doesn't have to," she insisted. "You were already going to leave Emma after the baby came. Your lawyer even said it was smarter to wait for financial reasons. This just gives us another reason to push forward with our plans." I looked at her then, really looked at her. "What plans?" She paused, and I could tell she knew she'd misspoken. "I just meant, we've talked about being a real couple, not having to hide anymore. With both of our babies on the way, it just seems right to make our relationship official." I told her, "Vanessa, I need some time to think." "Of course," she said. "I get it. But Richard, one more thing. Emma knows. She knows about us, and she knows about the baby. If we're going to get through this, we have to be smart." Just then, my phone buzzed. A text message. I glanced down, and I felt my blood just boil. "What is it?" Vanessa asked. It's Emma, I said. She's changed the locks on the house. Looking back, I can see the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes before she arranged her face into a mask of concern. She can't do that. That's your house. Technically, I corrected her, it's our house. We're married. I got up and started pacing. This is spiraling. First she calls the cops, now this. She's trying to start a scandal to ruin my reputation. Maybe that's her goal, Vanessa said, her voice quiet. Think about it, Richard. If she paints you as the bad guy in public, she gets more leverage in the divorce. She's not as clueless as you think. I stopped walking. I'd never thought of Emma as being that strategic, but Vanessa had a point. Emma had been surprisingly shrewd. Changing the locks that fast was a bold move, and calling the police over what I believed was a simple fall. It showed a kind of calculation I hadn't seen in my wife before. You might be right, I said, the idea slowly taking root. Emma has always been smarter than she lets on. Vanessa walked over to the window then and looked out over the city. There's something else you should probably know. When I was trying to talk to Emma in the garage, she said some things about your money, the business. It sounded like she's been looking through your files. What kind of things? She named restaurants where we've eaten, specific hotel charges from your trips. She has receipts, Richard. Someone has been helping her track your every move. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If Emma really had proof of my affair, she could use all of it against me in court. I need to call my lawyer, was all I could say. That's a good idea. But Richard, we need to talk about one more thing. Vanessa turned to face me, her expression dead serious. My condition, this pregnancy, if this all goes public, if it turns into a nasty court fight, the stress, it could be bad for the baby. I remember feeling this surge of protectiveness. Whatever my complicated feelings were about Emma's pregnancy, this baby felt different. This was my future with Vanessa, the life I thought I wanted. I won't let that happen, I told her, my voice firm. I'll take care of Emma. I'll make sure this doesn't become a circus. She smiled. But even then, I should have noticed how cold it was. I know you will. You always take care of the people you love. After she left, I tried to focus on putting out the fires. I called my lawyer, set up a meeting, and started mapping out how to handle Emma's accusations. But a part of my mind couldn't let go of something she'd said, that Emma had fallen, yet Vanessa knew all these tiny details about an investigation into our affair. It suggested their meeting wasn't nearly as accidental as she made it sound. I tried to ignore the thought. Vanessa loved me. She was having my child. She wouldn't lie to me about something like that. But as I stood there, looking out at the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that a huge piece of the puzzle was missing, something that would change everything. Of course, 3 floors down, a security guard named Jake Samuel Carter was watching a video that proved my trust in Vanessa was a terrible, terrible mistake. But I didn't know that. Not yet. For a little while longer, I was still living in my own little world, where my mistress was the victim. My wife was the crazy one. And my only problem was a PR mess. That fantasy was about to end. This is more than just assault. It's an attack on an unborn child. I found out later that was what Detective Lisa Reynolds said. She'd seen a lot in her 15 years on the force, but something about that security footage really got to her. She told me the whole thing looked so planned, the way Vanessa targeted Emma's stomach, and then just casually walked away. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold and calculated. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to tell me what happened one more time, Detective Reynolds asked her, her voice kind but firm. I can still picture Emma sitting in that hard plastic chair at the station, with Jake right there beside her, holding her hand. She told me she had to repeat the story 3 times but she knew how important it was to get it right. I left Dr. Mitchell's office around 2:30, she said. The appointment took a while because they did an extra ultrasound to check the baby's position. I was feeling so happy. Grace was perfectly healthy and growing right on schedule. The detective asked, "Grace is what you're naming your daughter?" "Yes," Emma said. "She's due in about 8 weeks." I remember when she told me that, how her hand went right to her belly. I was walking to my car in the garage, level 2, section C. I was digging in my purse for my keys when I heard my name called. "And did you recognize who it was?" the detective asked. "You know, I remember her name so clearly. Vanessa Hoffman. I'd seen her a few times at company parties. Someone from your grandfather's marketing department. When Detective Reynolds asked me about her, I told him how she acted. Angry, hostile. She called me a pathetic cow, if you can believe it. But looking back, there was something else there too. A kind of cold rehearsal. Like she had practiced every word. I tried to explain that to him. She knew these little details about Richard's plans, things she shouldn't have known. She mentioned his lawyer told him to wait until after the baby was born to file for divorce, for a better financial outcome. Things a man doesn't just casually tell his mistress, unless they were planning a future that didn't have room for me or my baby. The detective just took his notes. He asked if she had threatened my unborn child, and I told him she had. She said Richard never even wanted the baby. And when she hit me with that purse, sweetheart, she aimed it right at my stomach. She said something like, maybe I'd finally get the message. My voice didn't shake, but your Uncle Jake saw the tension in my shoulders. Then the detective had to ask, for the record, was it possible this whole thing was an accident? A conversation that just got out of hand? I remember looking right at him. I told him to watch the security video again, to see how she positioned herself before I even got there, how she waited for me to be all alone, how she specifically targeted my pregnancy. This was never an emotional outburst. It was planned from the start. Detective Reynolds just pulled up the footage your Uncle Jake's security company had cleaned up for them. We all just watched in silence as Vanessa slipped out from behind a pillar, confronted me, and then made that calculated attack. The detective asked Jake to explain what he was seeing. Jake? He just snapped into professional mode. He pointed out that Vanessa Hoffman showed up in the garage at around 2:15, a full 15 minutes before my appointment was even scheduled to be over. She hid herself behind Pillar 7, giving her a perfect view of my car while keeping her hidden from anyone passing by. How would she know when I'd be done? That was the part that sent a chill down my spine. She had been watching my schedule. My doctor's office confirmed that my appointments were always in the same time slot, every 2 weeks. Vanessa had timed it perfectly. Detective Reynolds kept writing in his notebook. Jake then pointed out her body language as she walked toward me. He said, this wasn't a woman who was upset or acting on a whim. Her movements were so controlled, so deliberate. You could see she had rehearsed this whole thing in her mind. She meant to cause harm. We watched again as Vanessa swung her purse at my belly with such clear intent. Jake continued, explaining the handbag weighed about 3 pounds based on its size and who made it. He said when you swing something like that with force at a pregnant woman's stomach, it could cause terrible complications, even a miscarriage. The fact that she went right for my stomach made it an attempted assault on an unborn child. Detective Reynolds paused the footage right at the moment it hit, and after I fell, Vanessa didn't check on me. She didn't call for help. She showed zero concern that she'd just knocked a pregnant woman to the ground. She just fixed her hair and left the scene. That isn't how someone acts when they feel bad about an accident. I watched the detective go over all the evidence, just praying he would see what was so obvious to the rest of us. This wasn't some silly spat or a misunderstanding. This was a targeted attack on me and my baby. He asked, "Mrs. Morrison, has your husband seen this footage?" I told him no. I had tried to tell him about the attack, but he just dismissed it. He told me I was being dramatic and that Vanessa would never do something like that. He actually believed that I just fell and imagined everything else. Then he asked if I had spoken to Miss Hoffman. I hadn't. But she had called Richard right after it happened. He told me she claimed I fell and she'd tried to help me. He believed her story. Detective Reynolds closed the file then and looked me in the eye. He said, "Mrs. Morrison, based on the evidence we have, I'm going to arrest Miss Hoffman." The charges were for aggravated assault. He said the fact that I was pregnant made it a felony. Oh, the wave of relief and validation I felt in that moment, but then he warned me that things were probably about to get very complicated. He said that Miss Hoffman would no doubt hire some expensive lawyer, that they might try to discredit me or suggest I was just some unstable, pregnant woman looking for attention. He asked if I was prepared for that. I remember looking over at Jake and then back at the detective. I told him, "Detective, 3 hours ago, I thought my biggest problem was a cheating husband. Now I know his mistress tried to hurt my unborn child. And my husband is so busy protecting her that he's willing to lie to me about what happened. I've learned an awful lot about what I can handle in a very short amount of time." Then he asked about your grandfather, how I thought he would react when Miss Hoffman was arrested. I knew, of course. He'd try to protect her. He would hire lawyers, say it was all one big misunderstanding, and try to make me out to be the bad guy. My voice got a little harder then. I told him that was his choice to make. I was finished protecting his good name at the expense of my own safety and my daughter's. Detective Reynolds stood up. He told me he'd have officers pick her up within the hour, and that I'd need to come back tomorrow to sign a formal statement. As we left the police station, Jake put his arm right around my shoulders. He asked me how I was feeling. I told him scared, relieved, angry, and determined all at once. And then I looked up at my brother. "Jake," I said, "there's something I need to tell you, something I just realized while we were in there." I told him, "Vanessa knew about my doctor's appointments. She knew the time, the place, everything. But I never told Richard my schedule, and I certainly never told Vanessa." I had to stop walking for a moment. Someone had been keeping tabs on my every move. Someone was watching me. Jake's whole face just turned to stone. He said, "Or someone has access to your medical records, your calendar, your personal information." Richard had access to all of that, of course, through our shared accounts, which meant either Richard had helped her plan this whole attack, or Vanessa had been systematically invading my privacy for weeks, maybe even months. Your Uncle Jake pulled out his phone right then. He said, "I'm calling Jimmy." They needed to do a full security check of the house, my car, my phone, everything. If someone was watching me, they had to find out how. As Jake made his calls, I stood on those courthouse steps and felt the very last of my illusions about my marriage just turned to dust. You see, this wasn't just about Richard having an affair anymore. This was a deliberate plan to get me out of his life, and they didn't seem to care if my unborn child was hurt in the process. But for the first time since that whole nightmare started, I didn't feel helpless. I had my proof, I had my brother, and I had a plan. Vanessa Hoffman was about to learn that when you attack the wrong pregnant woman, you can destroy a lot more than just a pregnancy. You can destroy a whole life. 2 babies, 2 women, 1 lying, cheating husband. Those words just kept echoing in my head as I sat in Jake's truck outside Morrison Tech Solutions, watching your grandfather's office building through the tinted windows. It had been 6 hours since Detective Reynolds had arrested Vanessa, And Richard's reaction had been exactly what I knew it would be: denial, anger, and an immediate call to his lawyer. Jake asked me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I told him we couldn't wait until tomorrow. I needed to see his face when he tried to explain all this. I remember putting my hand on my belly and saying I needed to hear him try to justify why his mistress knew my medical schedule so well she could ambush me. Just then, Jake's phone buzzed with a message from Jimmy Thompson. Vanessa had made bail 2 hours ago. Her lawyer had already filed papers claiming I was an unstable pregnant woman who was making up evidence to get a better divorce settlement. Of course she did, I said. My voice was just bitter. I asked what else Jimmy found. Her phone records showed she'd been calling Richard every day for the past 2 months, sometimes several times a day. On the day she attacked me, she called him right after. That didn't exactly match her story about being worried and trying to help me. "And?" I asked. Jake paused for a moment. "There's something else," he said. Jimmy had run a deeper background check on Vanessa. "She's not just pregnant, Emma. She's been seeing a specialist." I turned to stare at my brother. "What kind of specialist?" "A high-risk pregnancy doctor. She'd been having all sorts of complications. Spotting, high blood pressure, she was at risk of a miscarriage. Her own medical records showed she'd been told to avoid stress and any physical exertion. The idea of it was just shocking. She was risking her own pregnancy just to attack me. Jake said that was what made it all the more disturbing. She was so desperate to get me out of the picture that she was willing to risk her own baby's health to do it." As I let that sink in, I felt another piece of the horrible puzzle click right into place. I looked at Jake. "I want to talk to her." He said, "Absolutely not. Not by myself, but with him there, in a public place, somewhere safe." I just had to understand why she would do something like that. "You know, honey, your Uncle Jake thought I'd lost my mind. He kept saying, 'Emma, you're not thinking clearly. You've been through so much today.' But I remember telling him I was seeing things more clearly than I had in months. My voice didn't even shake. For 8 long months, I'd been making up reasons for Richard's behavior, always thinking it was my fault, trying to be the perfect, expectant mother. And that day, I found out his other woman was plotting to hurt me and the baby. So, what did I want? I wanted to see her face and ask her why. I needed to understand what brings a person to a place where hurting a pregnant woman seems like a good idea. And I needed her to know I wasn't just going to disappear. Jake, he just listened for a while. You could see him thinking it all through. He finally said, "If we do this, it's on my terms. Public place, we record everything, and you barely speak. The second she gets agitated, we're gone." I agreed to it all. He told me not to let her play with my emotions or try to make excuses for what she did. It's funny, I told him I wasn't after an apology, I was hunting for facts. I wanted to know exactly what Richard had told her about me, about us, about his plans for the future. Knowledge is power, after all. About 20 minutes later, we were in that little coffee shop downstairs from her apartment building. Your uncle had picked it for a reason. So many cameras, people everywhere, and lots of ways to get out fast. He even had Jimmy, one of his guys, sitting at a table across the room, just watching. Vanessa showed up right on schedule. She looked so pale, but still dressed perfectly. She was holding that expensive handbag of hers, the one she'd used on me that morning, just clutching it in her perfectly manicured hands. "Emma," she said, sliding into the seat across from us, "I'm surprised you wanted to see me." "I'm surprised you came," I told her, my voice perfectly level, "especially since you're looking at felony assault charges." You could see a little crack in her perfect facade then. "Oh, that's just a misunderstanding," she said. "My lawyer is sure they won't stick." Video footage can be tricky. Can it? That was the first time Jake spoke, and his voice was so quiet, it was terrifying. Because the footage I saw showed you swinging a 3-pound handbag directly at my sister's pregnant stomach. That looks pretty clear-cut to me. Vanessa shot this nervous look at Jake, like she was just then realizing he was dangerous. She asked, "And who are you?" "Jake Carter," he said. "Emma's brother. My company is the one that gave the footage to the police." All the color just washed out of her face when she put it together. You're in security?" I am security," he told her. "Ex-Marine, and now I run Carter Security Solutions. We look after people who need protecting." And then your uncle gave her this smile that was all teeth. "People like my pregnant sister who get cornered in parking garages?" Vanessa quickly turned her attention back to me, probably thinking I'd be an easier person to fool. "Emma, you have to know, I never meant for you to actually get hurt. It all just spiraled." "Did it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I've been replaying our little chat in that garage, and you said some very specific things. Things about Richard's divorce strategy that sounded like you knew way too much." "I have no idea what you're talking about. You mentioned Richard's lawyer told him to wait until after the baby arrived to get a better deal. You knew about his work trips, what he was spending, how he supposedly felt about me being pregnant. That isn't just late-night chatter, Vanessa. That's battle planning." She started to fidget in her seat. "Richard and I, we tell each other everything. We're very open." "Unlike with his wife, you mean?" I asked. "That's not the same. How is it different?" She leaned in then, her voice getting all intense. "Emma, listen. Richard never wanted this baby. He told me from day one it was a mistake, that you got pregnant to trap him right when his business was taking off." I felt your Uncle Jake's hand on my arm then, just a light touch to keep me steady. "Go on," he said to her. "He said you got obsessed with babies, that you weren't the fun woman he married anymore, that you didn't care about his dreams, you wouldn't travel or go to work events. The only things you cared about were picking out cribs and baby names and making him a boring suburban dad." Every single word was like a punch to the gut, you know, but I made myself sit there and take it. "And you thought that gave you the right to attack me?" I asked. "I wasn't trying to attack you," she finished. "I was trying to show you that it was hopeless to hang on to him. His heart is with someone else now, with me and with our baby." Those last two words just hung there in the silence. "Your baby," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Her hand went to her stomach, which was still completely flat. "Yes, Richard and I are having a child he actually wants, one we planned for." "Planned for?" I heard Jake echo her words. "When exactly did you plan for this baby, Vanessa? What does that mean? Did you and Richard decide to have a child before or after you knew my sister was pregnant?" She finally saw her mistake. She'd said way too much. It's a complicated situation." "Oh, I don't think it's complicated at all," I said, my voice soft. "I think Richard got scared when he found out I was pregnant. Because it got in the way of whatever promises he'd made to you. And so, the two of you decided that if I happened to lose my baby, your problem would just disappear. That's not what happened, isn't it?" I took out my phone and just opened the calendar. "Let's look. You've been with Richard for 8 months. You're about 10 weeks along. I'm 31 weeks pregnant. A little math shows you got pregnant right about the time my own pregnancy would have been impossible for him to hide anymore." I remember Jake just watching her face while I laid it all out. She was cornered and had no idea what to say. "The timing is certainly curious," Jake added, his voice so casual. "It seems like you either had an accidental pregnancy at a very opportune moment, Or you planned it to give Richard another family to choose from. You have no idea what it's been like, Vanessa said, sounding desperate. Emma, Richard loves me, she pleaded. He wants a life with me. Your baby was just something we had to get past. I just looked at this woman, who had tried to hurt me and my child with such carelessness, and a kind of calm settled over me. You're right, I said quietly. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what kind of person would intentionally try to harm a baby just to get what she wants. I can't imagine reaching a point where you think trying to kill a child is a reasonable way to solve your love life problems. It wasn't attempted murder. You took a heavy object and aimed it right at my stomach, hoping I'd miscarry. What else would you call it? She jumped to her feet then, her composure just shattering. I call it fighting for the man I love and the family we're supposed to have. The whole coffee shop got quiet, and everyone was just staring at this unhinged woman by the window. Vanessa, I said. I said, and I stood up too. I truly hope your baby is born healthy and safe from your terrible judgment, because someday that child is going to want to know why their father went to prison for conspiracy to commit assault. And you'll have to find a way to tell them you thought your affair was more important than a human life. She just gaped at me, completely stunned. Prison? She whispered. Richard isn't going to prison. He didn't do anything. A little smile touched my lips then. Oh, he didn't have to. He just gave you my doctor's schedule, my private information, and his blessing to get rid of his problem. That makes him an accessory to the attempted assault of an unborn child. When we left that coffee shop, Jake put his arm around me. He asked, "How are you doing?" And I told him, "I feel like I've spent years married to a complete stranger." For 4 years, your mother told me. And now I feel like I'm about to be a single mom to a daughter her own father never even wanted. And then, honey, I saw a look in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just anger, it was this fierce, protective fire, just like your grandmother had. She said, "Grace and I are going to be just fine without him." That's when I knew it was time to show Richard who he'd really crossed. I spent that night in my office, about 3 in the morning, just me and a wall of monitors. For 4 hours straight, I combed through 8 months of footage, building the case that would take his life apart just like he'd done to hers. The irony, you see, was that he'd hired me, his wife's brother, to protect his secrets, and now I was using his own system to expose every last one. My partner Jimmy called me over from his computer, where he'd been digging through the finances. "You have to see this, Jake," he said. "Richard wasn't just cheating. He was stealing." He pulled up a spreadsheet. All those private dinners with Vanessa were listed as client entertainment. The hotel rooms for their business meetings lined up perfectly with when the affair started. Even Vanessa's medical visits were disguised as company health seminars. I looked at the numbers. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "A conservative guess," he said, "is $250,000 in personal stuff charged to the company. But it's worse." Jimmy switched to another screen. He'd been using company cards to cover Vanessa's apartment lease, her car, and even her designer handbags, including the one she used to attack your mother. And it hit me then. This wasn't just a messy affair. It was fraud, embezzlement, a misuse of company money. The kind of thing that sends people to jail. "It gets better," Jimmy said. "Ever wonder how Vanessa always knew your mom's schedule?" I just looked at him. Richard had been logging into their shared insurance account, pulling Emma's medical records, and just forwarding them to Vanessa. Jimmy showed me the emails, every single doctor's appointment, date, time, location. For months, He'd been helping her track his own wife. My anger just turned cold, you know? It became a strategy. Jimmy, I said, I need you to put together 3 separate packages of everything we have. One for the police, one for his board of directors, and one for your mom's lawyer. He was already on it, but he told me there was something else. Something that was going to make everything even messier. What? I asked. Jimmy showed me another set of files. Richard had been looking up ways to challenge the paternity of his own baby, of you. He was talking with lawyers about forcing DNA tests, trying to plant the idea that you might not be his, all to build a case for avoiding child support. I just stared at the screen. Your mom had been completely faithful to him. He knew you were his child, but you see, it didn't matter if he knew it. It only mattered if he could create enough doubt to save himself some money. Jimmy pointed to a summary from one of the lawyers. It said that if Richard could prove infidelity, or even just create doubt about who your father was, he could drastically lower what he'd have to pay. So he was setting your mom up to look unstable while he played the victim, to make this even more complicated. What? Jimmy pulled up another set of records. Richard's been researching ways to challenge paternity of Emma's baby. He's been consulting with lawyers about forcing DNA tests, claiming the child might not be his, laying groundwork to avoid child support obligations. Jake stared at the screen in disbelief. Emma's been faithful their entire marriage. He knows that baby is his. It doesn't matter if he knows it. It matters if he can create enough doubt to reduce his financial obligations. Look at this consultation summary. Jimmy highlighted a document. His lawyer advised him that if he could prove infidelity or create reasonable doubt about paternity, he could significantly reduce alimony and child support payments. So he's been setting up Emma to look unstable and unfaithful while positioning himself as the injured, proceedings considerably. I went completely still. Are you telling me, I said, that his lawyer suggested he end the pregnancy? I'm saying, Jimmy replied carefully, the notes list different ways to simplify the divorce, and a pregnancy loss is noted as one of the things that would be advantageous to their client. At that moment, all the noise in my head just stopped. My military training kicked in, and it all became a mission. Richard didn't just let Vanessa attack your mom. He helped her. He gave her the schedule. He knew the legal benefits if your mom lost you. And he was funding a woman he knew was unstable enough to hurt a pregnant woman. That made him an accessory to assault, and a conspirator in a plan to harm his own child. It made him so much more than that. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. Jimmy, I said, secure every bit of this. Evidence, immediately. Multiple backups, multiple locations, and I want a copy in Detective Reynolds' hands within the hour. So, what's the plan? He asked. I remember a grim little smile crossed my face. Richard Morrison thinks he's been playing a game of chess with Emma. He has no idea he's been playing against me. About 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my truck outside your mom's house, just watching her move around the kitchen. It was 3:30 in the morning, and she was making tea, too shaken up to sleep. I saw her stop and rest a hand on her belly, quietly talking to the baby her husband never wanted. That's when my phone rang. It was Detective Reynolds. Mr. Carter, I have your evidence. We need to talk. I'm listening. This changes everything, he said. We're not just looking at a simple assault anymore. With the proof you sent over showing premeditation and coordination between Mr. Morrison and Ms. Hoffman, we're looking at conspiracy, potentially even federal charges if we can prove they used phones or email to plan it. What do you need me to do? I asked. I need you to understand, he said, that when we arrest him, this will turn into a media circus. Your sister is going to be put under a microscope. Are you all prepared for that? I looked through the window at your mom, at her quiet strength. Detective, I told him, my sister has survived her husband's betrayal, his girlfriend's attack, and learning that the father of her child wanted to ruin her life for money. I think she can handle a few reporters. And what about you? He asked. This is going to bring your role in all this to light. You could face accusations of entrapment, invasion of privacy, all of it. But I was ready. My security firm has contracts all over downtown, I said. Richard Morrison hired me to protect his company. I simply documented evidence of crimes that were committed in areas I was paid to watch. Everything I gathered is legal, and it will hold up in court. Mr. Carter, he said, there's something else. Ms. Hoffman is claiming your sister provoked the attack by threatening her pregnancy. She's going to say your sister was trying to cause a miscarriage. My temper flared right then. That's ridiculous, I said. I know, he sighed, but that's going to be her defense. She's going to paint Mrs. Morrison as the aggressor, claiming she was just defending herself and her unborn child. The affair, the baby, they'll use it all as ammunition to make your sister look unstable. Woman who attacked her husband's pregnant mistress. Do they have anything to back that up? I asked. Nothing, he said, but they have deep pockets for lawyers and every reason to discredit your sister. This is going to be a nasty fight. And I thought about everything your mom had been through and everything she was still facing. A brutal divorce, becoming a single mother, starting her whole life over from nothing. She deserved better than to spend the next year of her life fighting lies in a courtroom. Detective Reynolds, I said, what if I told you I could give you more evidence, something that would make their entire defense impossible to argue? What kind of evidence are we talking about? He asked. The kind, I said, that shows Richard Morrison didn't just know about the attack. He actively encouraged it by discussing the legal benefits of a pregnancy loss with his lawyer. There was a long silence on the other end. Mr. Carter, he finally said, his voice low, if you have evidence of that, we're not just talking about assault and conspiracy anymore. We're talking about attempted murder. I knew. The question is, I said, are you prepared to prosecute a millionaire for conspiracy to murder his wife and unborn child? Mr. Carter, he replied, if the evidence supports it, I'll prosecute anyone. I don't care what's in their bank account. Good, I said, because Richard Morrison is about to find out that money can't protect you from the consequences of your choices. After I hung up, I looked at your mom's house one last time. The next day, her world was going to change all over again. But this time, it was going to be for the better. You see, Richard had made one huge mistake in his whole elaborate plan to ruin her life. He hired the wrong man to keep his secrets. But you see, all those secrets he'd kept from me were about to come back and ruin him. Your Uncle Jake told me he went to see Richard first thing the next day. Surprised to see me, brother-in-law? He'd said. Richard was at his desk when Jake walked in without even knocking. It was only 8:30 in the morning, and Richard was already swamped with calls from the news about Vanessa's arrest. The last person he wanted to see was his head of security with some minor problem. Jake, whatever it is, it'll have to wait, he'd said. I'm in the middle of a family emergency. Funny you should say that, Jake replied, because what I'm here to talk about is directly connected to your little family crisis. Then Jake shut the office door and locked it. Do you mind if I have a seat? Something in Jake's voice made Richard finally pay attention. There was this cold, serious tone he'd never heard from Jake before. What is this about? Richard asked. Jake just made himself comfortable in the chair across from Richard's big desk and took out a tablet. It's about 8 months of video surveillance, bank statements, and text messages, Jake said, and together They tell a very clear story about what you've been doing outside of your marriage. Richard, of course, went pale. I have no idea what you're talking about. You don't? Jake just tapped the screen on his tablet, and the big monitor in Richard's office lit up with a video of him and Vanessa walking into a Marriott. March 15th, Jake said. You billed this hotel room to the company as client entertainment. The client, Peterson Industries, says that meeting never happened. Richard just stared at the screen, his mind probably spinning. Jake, listen, I can explain all of this. Can you? Jake asked. Because I've got 7 more examples of you and Miss Hoffman using company money for your little getaways. Hotels, dinners, doctor's visits, even the security deposit on her apartment. $250,000 he'd stolen over 8 months. Jake told me he showed Richard a screen with every single charge listed out. It was then, he said, that Richard's whole world just fell apart. He apparently asked Jake how he got those confidential records. Jake's response was ice cold, that they weren't so confidential when they showed crimes happening under his watch. But the real blow, Jake said, came next. He pulled up the emails between Richard and Vanessa. My heart still sinks remembering this part. My appointment for Thursday at 2:30, Memorial Medical, Level 2 parking. Jake read it aloud to him, how she's usually there for 45 minutes and always parks in Section C. An email he sent to Vanessa the very same day she attacked me. Richard's blood must have run cold, and that's when Jake dropped the biggest bomb. My sister, he told Richard, Emma Catherine Morrison, your wife, is my little sister. I can only imagine Richard's face. Jake leaned in, and he told me he let all the big brother rage show in his eyes. He asked him if he really thought he could ruin my life and no one would come for him. If he believed he could steal from his company, plot against his own pregnant wife, and just walk away clean. Richard tried to deny it, of course, saying he never plotted to hurt anyone. But Jake was ready. He showed him the notes from his own divorce lawyer. Notes where Richard had asked about the legal advantages of me losing the baby. Can you imagine? It would simplify things, the lawyer said. No child support. Notes from the exact same month he started giving Vanessa my schedule. Richard just stared at it, completely cornered. He tried to claim it was privileged information. Jake shot back that privilege doesn't cover planning a crime. That's when Jake stood up. And I guess Richard finally realized my brother wasn't just some tech guy. He was a Marine. Jake laid it all out. You hired Vanessa to get rid of your wife and unborn child. Richard denied it, saying he'd never told her to physically hurt me. But Jake had the final nail for that coffin. A text message from Richard to Vanessa, the day it happened. He knows about us. Handle it. He'd sent it 30 minutes before she found me in that parking garage. Richard tried to backtrack, of course, saying he just meant for her to talk to me, to explain. But Jake didn't let up. He pointed out that Vanessa clearly took it as permission to attack me. And when I called Richard from the hospital, what did he do? He defended her. Jake told him flat out, that makes you an accessory. Right then, the intercom buzzed. It was his assistant announcing visitors. Urgent visitors. Jake told me he just looked at his watch, everything going exactly to plan. He told the assistant to send them in. And in walked Detective Reynolds, a couple of officers, and 3 others who just screamed federal agent. Detective Reynolds didn't waste a moment. Richard James Morrison, he said, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, embezzlement, and being an accessory to harming an unborn child. As they read him, his Miranda rights, Richard just stared at Jake, stunned. He kept saying, you planned this, all of it. And Jake, bless him, just said, no, I've been protecting Emma the whole time." He reminded Richard that he was hired for security, and that's what he did. He found a threat and handed it over to the authorities. Then one of the feds stepped up, explaining they had warrants for everything and that using phones to plan a crime made it their business too. As the cuffs clicked on his wrists, Richard finally seemed to get it. He started pleading about me, that I'd be ruined if the company failed, that I'd lose everything. Jake never flinched. He just told him I'd be fine, that I have a brother who actually looks out for me, not one who is willing to get rid of his own baby for money. As they were leading him away, Richard turned back frantic, saying the company needed a leader. Jake calmly informed him that the board had already put the company under emergency management. His job was gone. His assets were frozen. Richard was speechless. "You can't do that. I didn't do anything." But Jake just explained that the board had seen the proof. Funny how executives who steal and plot assaults tend to be bad for business. He was almost at the elevator when the last piece clicked into place for him. He looked at Jake and said, "You were never just head of security, were you?" And Jake, he told me he gave him a real smile then. The first one that day, he said, "No, Richard, I was Emma's big brother, making sure she was safe from men like you." As the doors slid shut, Jake sent me a text, just 2 lines. "It's done. He can't hurt you anymore." I was downstairs in the lobby the whole time with my lawyer and Dr. Mitchell, who was there just to keep an eye on me. When I read that text, a weight I'd carried for months just vanished. Richard spent 8 months trying to tear my life down. My brother spent 8 months building a fortress around me. It was as simple as that. For the first time since I found out about the affair, I let myself truly believe that Grace and I were going to be okay. When they called me into the boardroom, it felt like I was walking into a different world. It was set up like a courtroom, with the whole board sitting around that huge table, looking so grim as they read through the files Jake had given them. Richard's chair at the head of the table was empty, a symbol of how fast things can change. I sat next to my new lawyer, Sarah, with my hands resting on my belly. At 32 weeks pregnant, every little thing was an effort, but my head was perfectly clear. This was about making sure my daughter had a future. Thomas Bradley, one of the first investors, called the meeting to order. "Mr. Carter," he said, "please begin." Jake stood up at the front, all business. He was every bit the professional, you know? He walked them through it just like a military briefing, because he knew my whole future was riding on it. He told them how, for 8 months, Richard had stolen from the company to pay for his affair, given out private information, and helped plan an attack on a pregnant woman. He said the evidence was overwhelming. The big screen behind him lit up with all of Richard's fake charges. Hotels, fancy dinners, even her rent, all billed to the company. The final tally was $257,432. Jake didn't miss a detail. He pointed out that the money even paid for his mistress's personal things, including the very designer handbag she hit me with. It was so surreal. One of the board members, Jessica Walsh, asked about the assault and what it meant for the company legally. Jake explained that because Richard had used company resources, accessing my private medical files through their own insurance system, to help Vanessa attack me, the company itself could be sued. You could feel the air go out of the room. A lawsuit from me could have been the end of them. But then Jake continued, saying that I had no plans to sue, as long as the board did the right thing about Richard. Mr. Bradley looked right at me then. "Mrs. Morrison," he asked, "would you like to say something?" I took a deep breath and stood up, one hand on my daughter. "I remember walking in, 8 months pregnant with you, my hand resting on my back. I felt strangely calm. 'Gentlemen, ladies,' I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I reminded them how, for 4 years, I'd been the wife who helped his career, attending all those company functions. I glanced at those faces I knew so well from countless parties. I told them I'd learned about his affair 2 months prior and about the stolen money just a day ago. But it wasn't until his girlfriend attacked us that I truly understood what he was. You could have heard a pin drop. Then I laid it all out. Richard stole over $250,000 for his affair and used company resources to help hurt a pregnant woman. He and his mistress had planned to get rid of what he called the obstacles in his path. It was strange. My voice actually got stronger as I spoke. I told them this wasn't just about his crimes, but about Morrison Tech's future. The company had wonderful people and ideas. It didn't need to be ruined by one man's selfishness. I'll never forget Jessica Walsh leaning forward, asking me what I was proposing. I said I wanted the company to survive without him. I suggested they sell his stock to repay the funds he took, and find new leaders who actually believed integrity was more than just a word on a poster. Old Thomas Bradley seemed to really like that idea. Then they asked what I wanted in exchange. Simple, I said. I wouldn't file any claims against Morrison Tech for what Richard did. Their part of the problem ended when he was fired and prosecuted. They all looked at each other. I was handing them a clean way out that still held Richard accountable for everything. Then a board member, David Kim, asked what guarantee they had that I wouldn't change my mind and sue later. My lawyer, Sarah, stood up immediately. She said I was ready to sign an agreement protecting the company as long as they cooperated with the prosecution and sold the stock. Someone wondered if Richard would even agree. That's when your Uncle Jake chimed in. He reminded them all that Richard's assets were being frozen. He could either sell the stock or the court would just seize it as profits from his crimes. He'd cooperate. Right then, the door opened and Richard walked in between two officers and his lawyer. He was out on bail, but looked terrible. His expensive suit couldn't hide that his entire world had collapsed in 24 hours. Thomas Bradley told him formally that the board was terminating his employment, effective immediately. They were also pursuing full criminal charges for theft and conspiracy. Richard just stared at all of them, people he'd called friends for years. He sputtered, "You can't do this. I built this company." But Jessica Walsh cut him off, saying he nearly destroyed it, along with any trust they had. David Kim added that the evidence of financial theft and the conspiracy was overwhelming. They had no choice but to protect the company's interests. I saw his lawyer whisper something, and Richard's shoulders just fell. He looked right at me. "What do you want from me?" I stood up to face the man I was married to for 4 years. I wanted him to sign papers selling his stock to repay the money he stole. I wanted him to cooperate with the police. And I wanted him to stay away from me and my daughter, forever. He actually begged, "Emma, please, we can fix this." My voice was ice. I told him we didn't build anything. He built a fantasy, and I was just living in it. The difference was, I was strong enough to face the truth. He looked around desperately, telling them all they were making a mistake, that the company would fail without him. Thomas Bradley just stood up and said the company's vision didn't include embezzlement or plotting to commit assault. They would take their chances. Then, Jessica Walsh turned to me. On behalf of the whole board, she apologized for everything and thanked me. Said the company owed me. I just gave a little nod. "Just make sure it never happens again," I said, "and see that justice is served." As the officers led him away for the second time in 2 days, he turned back for one last plea. He said he never meant for Vanessa to hurt me. Can you imagine? For a second, I almost pitied him. I looked at him and said, "Richard, you spent months planning how to get me and our daughter out of your life. The only thing you never meant to do was get caught. The door clicked shut, and just like that, a whole chapter of my life was over. But when I looked at the supportive faces still at the table, your Uncle Jake, my lawyer, even the board members who chose justice over loyalty, I knew something. It wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of the life I was going to build for you and me. Then Thomas Bradley cleared his throat. He said the board had one more thing to discuss. I was completely surprised. He explained that Morrison Tech would need someone to lead temporarily. They were prepared to offer me a consulting role to guide the company through the crisis. He said my business degree and what I knew of the company would be invaluable. I just blinked at him. I told him I hadn't worked in business for 4 years. He said, no, but you've been watching this company's operations from the inside. He told me I knew the clients, the culture, and had shown more leadership in the last 24 hours than Richard had in the past year. I remember seeing your Uncle Jake smiling so proudly. He always said I was the brains of the family. Richard just never bothered to notice. I pointed out the obvious, that I was about to have a baby and couldn't commit to a crazy schedule. But Jessica Walsh jumped right in. She said they meant part-time consulting, from home, after you were born. It was work that needed my mind, not my physical presence. I looked over at your uncle, and he nodded. It was a chance at financial independence, all my own. You know, I'll never forget what Thomas Bradley told me that day. Your own income, he said, your own professional identity. It was a lifeline. Leaving Morrison Tech, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Not just for getting by, but for a real future. Your Uncle Jake drove me home, and we just sat in silence, both of us trying to grasp it all. Richard's life was imploding, and mine, well, mine was just starting over. When we got to the house, Jake asked how I was doing. I told him it felt like I could finally breathe after holding my breath for 8 long months. And I knew, right then, that you were going to see that your mother never, ever gave up. I had to ask Jake, he's really going to prison, isn't he? He said the detective expected a plea bargain, maybe 3 to 5 years for everything he did, and Vanessa would likely get 2 years. It's strange, but I felt this wave of sadness along with the relief. I never wanted to destroy his life, just to stop him from destroying mine. But Jake, he put it so clearly. Richard destroyed his own life when he decided we weren't as important as his secrets. And in that moment, I felt you give a strong kick, as if you were cheering me on. That's when I finally let out a real laugh. It hit me then, everything Jake had orchestrated. I asked him, how long have you been planning all this? He got quiet for a minute. He said it all started that night in the parking garage, when he saw what Vanessa did and realized Richard was protecting her instead of me. That's when it became a war for him. I said, you used your company against your own client. And he just looked at me and said, no, I used my company to protect my sister and my niece. Richard stopped being his client, he said, the moment he became a threat to our family. I just reached for his hand and said thank you for everything, for believing me. Jake told me something then that I've always held on to. He said a year before, I might have just accepted Richard's lies and blamed myself. But that day, I stood up and demanded the truth. He said, you are going to be proud of me. Walking back into my house, truly my house now, I felt a kind of peace settle over me. The man who betrayed me was facing justice. The woman who attacked me was gone. The company was making things right. And most of all, you and I were safe, and we were loved. Just then, my phone lit up with a text from Dr. Mitchell, asking how we were doing. We were doing better than we had in months, I told her. As I sat down in my favorite old armchair, the one Richard always wanted to throw out, I realized I was actually looking forward to the next day. A tomorrow without lies. A tomorrow where I could make choices for us, for you and me, not to protect a man's reputation. A tomorrow where I could start building the life we deserved. You kicked again, and I whispered to my belly, "It's just us, baby girl, but we're going to be just fine." Better than fine. We were going to be happy. Outside, your uncle sat in his truck a while longer, just watching over us. And while he was sitting there, his phone rang. It was Detective Reynolds. He called to tell Jake that Richard's lawyer was accepting the plea deal. 3 years for one charge, 2 for another, to be served at the same time. He'd be up for parole in about 18 months. Vanessa got 2 years, plus 3 on probation. The detective also mentioned that the stress had caused complications with her pregnancy. For a moment, it was just sad, thinking of another innocent child caught in the mess. Then he confirmed the settlement was being finalized and that I'd be walking away with a clean slate and financial security. So, it was over. Well, the criminal part was. The detective did warn Jake that Richard was already talking about appealing, trying to say I'd set him up as revenge. It was almost laughable. Jake's jaw got tight, but he wasn't worried. He knew every piece of evidence they had was solid. The truth was just too overwhelming. The detective was just giving us a heads up that men like Richard don't go down without a fight. After the call, Jake looked up at our house one last time. He could see the lights on in your nursery, see me moving around, getting ready for you. No threat Richard could make would change the facts. And I wasn't that naive girl he married 8 months before. I was your mother now, and I knew what mattered wasn't money, but strength and honesty. Richard had lost so much more than his freedom. He'd lost the chance to be a part of our lives, and that was a loss no appeal could ever fix. 3 months later, there you were. I was holding you, my little Grace Elizabeth Carter Morrison, in the rocking chair Jake had made. I'd changed our names to give us a fresh start. You were 7 pounds of pure perfection, with my dark hair and your uncle's determined little chin. "She's beautiful," Jake whispered. And he was right. You were absolutely perfect. Looking at you, I felt a kind of peace I'd never known. Those 3 months had been a whirlwind, getting everything settled, but they felt more honest than my whole adult life had been. I told Jake what Dr. Mitchell had said, that you were developing perfectly, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and apparently your father's stubborn streak. Jake just smiled and said that stubbornness would serve you well. Then he asked about my meeting at Morrison Tech. I was so proud to tell him they'd offered me the Director of Strategic Development job. They wanted me part-time for the first year, so I'd have time with you. The salary was more than enough for us to live on and even start a college fund for you. I told him I'd already accepted. It turned out all those years I spent managing Richard's life taught me more about running a business than I ever knew. Jake just grinned and said he could have told them that himself. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard's lawyer. My stomach tightened. He wanted to schedule a video call from prison so Richard could see you. Jake's face darkened, but he just asked me what I wanted to do. And honey, all I wanted was to protect you from the man who helped hurt us before you were even born. But I also knew that one day you'd ask questions. I needed to be able to tell you I'd given him a chance to be a father. So, I made a decision. One call. It would be supervised, it would be recorded, and any contact after that would depend entirely on him. If he used his time to change, we could talk about the future. If he spent it blaming everyone else, well, then you would be better off without him. Jake nodded. He knew it was fair, and just then, our doorbell rang. Jake went to get it, and I stayed with you. I could hear voices I knew from the hallway, and then your grandmother Patricia, Richard's mom, appeared in the doorway of your little room. "Emma, dear," she said, so gently, and her gaze just landed right on you. She's just so beautiful. Oh, honey, I had been dreading that moment for ages. Your grandmother was this powerful woman who, let's be honest, never thought I was good enough. I was braced for anger, for her to make excuses for Richard, but instead, she walked over to the rocking chair with tears welling up. May I? She asked, looking at you. I carefully passed you into her arms, and I watched her whole face just change as she held you for the very first time. She has Richard's face as a baby, she whispered, but I can already see your mother's strength in her. I started to say her formal name, but she stopped me. Patricia, please. And Emma, I need to apologize. A very deep apology. I was so taken aback, I just blinked. For what? For raising a boy who believed his own desires mattered more than his duties, for failing to show him that marriage and being a father meant sacrifice and true commitment. Her voice was just thick with unshed tears, and for not realizing sooner that you were the one person who could have helped him become a better man. Patricia, I said, you couldn't have known. Oh, I knew Richard was selfish. I knew he felt the world owed him everything. I just told myself those were strengths, not problems that needed fixing. She finally looked up from you and met my eyes. I didn't succeed with him as a mother, but I refused to fail this little one as a grandmother. I just felt the tears start streaming down my face. What are you saying? I'm saying, no matter what happens with Richard, I am going to be in your life, Grace. I want to help you raise her, be there for you both, and make sure she grows up knowing she comes from a family that believes in doing the right thing. Just then, Jake poked his head in. Is everything all right in here? Everything is absolutely perfect, I told him, dabbing at my eyes. Patricia was just laying out her plans to spoil her new granddaughter. Well, within limits, Patricia said, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from her in years. This girl is going to know her value. She'll understand her roots, and she will grow up surrounded by so much genuine love. As she sat there holding you, telling you all these family stories Richard had never even mentioned to me, I felt another part of my heart begin to mend. You see, you weren't going to miss out on having a big family. You would have a grandmother who finally understood that love was about more than money, a young uncle who would have fought dragons for you, and a mom who had learned that being strong meant standing up for what you believe in. Emma, Patricia said softly, I have something for you. She passed me a little velvet box. Inside lay an old sapphire ring with tiny diamonds all around it. This belonged to my grandmother. Richard never asked for it when he proposed because he claimed you wouldn't like antique jewelry. Her voice had a sharp edge to it. He was wrong about that too, wasn't he? Patricia, I can't accept this. It's not for you to wear now. It's for Grace, for when she's old enough to know what it means to belong to a family that cherishes a lasting love, not just a fleeting romance. My hands were shaking as I took the little box. Thank you, and thank you for giving me a granddaughter I can be so proud of, and for having the strength to protect her when her own father couldn't. As that afternoon drifted by, I realized I was surrounded by a family I had chosen, not one I was born into. Your Uncle Jake was busy putting together a new changing table. Patricia was sorting all your tiny clothes by size and season, and even Dr. Mitchell had popped in to see how we both were. Your recovery is just amazing, Dr. Mitchell told me after her checkup. Physically and in your spirit, you're in better shape than you were for most of the pregnancy. Stress is a funny thing, I told her. When I was living with Richard's deceit, my body felt like it was always on edge, always anxious. Now that the truth is out, and I'm the one making the decisions, it all just feels lighter. On that note, she asked gently, have you considered seeing anyone again? It's perfectly normal for new moms to think about the future. I remember looking over at you, wide awake in your grandmother's arms. For now, all my energy is going into being the best mom I can be. But one day, when the time is right, I hope I find someone who loves Grace just as much as he loves me. Someone who sees her as the gift she is, not a complication. You will, Dr. Mitchell said, and she sounded so sure of it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.